It's 1991. A pilot rolls in over the Kuwaiti desert at 15,000 feet. He's not looking for a target. He doesn't have a laser locked on anything. He doesn't even know exactly where the tanks are. He releases a single bomb, pulls off, and flies home. 30 seconds later, that bomb, falling through empty air with no guidance from any human being, picks up the infrared signature of an Iraqi T-72, steers itself toward the engine deck, and kills the tank. No one told it which tank. No one pointed a laser. No one was even watching. The bomb decided, how does a weapon dropped from 3 miles up find its own target in a battlefield full of burning oil wells and scattered wreckage? How does it tell the difference between a tank and a truck? And how did the United States build something like this in the 1980s, decades before anyone was talking about autonomous weapons? The answer is a munition called the CBU-97 Sensor Fuzed Weapon. And the story behind it is one of the strangest in modern military history. It wasn't born from some black-budget skunkworks program or a single dramatic invention. It came from a problem that haunted NATO planners for 40 years, a problem so severe that entire war plans were built around the assumption it couldn't be solved. The problem was simple to state and almost impossible to fix. The Soviet Union had too many tanks. Not just a lot of tanks, an overwhelming number. By the early 1980s, Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces had more than 50,000 main battle tanks staged across Eastern Europe. NATO had a fraction of that. In a conventional war, those armored columns would pour through the Fulda Gap into West Germany, and Allied forces would be outnumbered on every front. The math didn't work. You couldn't kill them fast enough with aircraft dropping dumb bombs. You couldn't build enough anti-tank missiles. You couldn't lay enough mines. Every simulation, every war game, every planning exercise came back with the same conclusion. NATO loses the ground war in Europe unless something fundamental changes. So, the Pentagon started asking a different question. What if the bomb itself could find the tank? What if you could remove the human from the targeting loop entirely? Not because you wanted autonomy for its own sake, but because a pilot hunting individual tanks one at a time was simply too slow to matter. The idea wasn't philosophical, it was mathematical. You needed a kill rate that human reaction time couldn't deliver. If you're the kind of person who finds stories like this fascinating, weapons that changed the math of entire wars before they were ever used, then this channel was built for you. A like and a subscribe go a long way toward keeping these deep dives coming. And drop a comment below if there's a weapon system or a forgotten program you want pulled apart next. What emerged from that requirement was unlike anything in the American arsenal. The sensor-fused weapon didn't need a forward observer on the ground. It didn't need a pod on the aircraft tracking targets with infrared or laser designation. It didn't need data links, GPS coordinates, or satellite imagery fed into a cockpit display. The weapon carried its own sensor suite. It carried its own targeting logic. Once released, it was entirely on its own, a bomb that functioned less like a munition and more like a small, disposable, single-use robot designed to fall from the sky, scan the battlefield below, identify anything that looked like an armored vehicle, and kill it. All in the span of a few seconds. All without a single human input after release. And the engineers who built it had to solve a problem no one had ever solved before. "We were not planning to win," General Sir John Hackett wrote in his 1978 bestseller, The Third World War. "We were planning to lose slowly enough for the politicians to negotiate." That was the secret NATO never said out loud. The entire defense of Western Europe, the most expensive military alliance in human history, was built on the assumption of failure. Not eventual failure, immediate failure. The war plans called it trading space for time, which was a polite way of saying West Germany would be overrun in the first 72 hours, and the best anyone could hope for was an orderly retreat to the Rhine. The reason was armor. Pure, simple, overwhelming armor. The Soviet Union didn't just invest in tanks, it built its entire theory of war around them. Deep battle doctrine, operational maneuver groups, echeloned attacks designed to hit NATO lines in waves, punching through at multiple points simultaneously so that no reserve force could plug every gap. The first echelon hits you. While you're recovering, the second echelon rolls through the breach. By the time the third echelon arrives, your front line doesn't exist anymore. And the numbers behind that doctrine were staggering. NATO intelligence estimates in the early 1980s counted over 50,000 Warsaw Pact tanks, T-64s, T-72s, T-80s, with production lines that could replace losses faster than Western factories could build replacements. The Soviet tank park wasn't just large, it was regenerative. You could destroy 1,000 of them, and the strategic math barely changed. NATO had answers, but none of them scaled. Attack helicopters like the Apache could kill tanks, but they were expensive, vulnerable to air defense, and there were never enough of them. Anti-tank guided missiles worked, but a soldier with a TOW launcher had to track the target for 10 full seconds, an eternity on a battlefield where return fire arrives in 3. Ground attack aircraft could deliver precision munitions, but each sortie killed one target, maybe 2, and the pilot had to survive a gauntlet of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles to do it. Run the numbers, and the deficit was devastating. NATO needed to destroy roughly 3,000 armored vehicles per day to blunt a full-scale Warsaw Pact offensive. Existing weapons and tactics could deliver maybe a third of that. The gap wasn't a margin of error. It was a death sentence. So, planners started looking at the problem differently. The bottleneck wasn't firepower. NATO had plenty of aircraft and plenty of bombs. The bottleneck was the targeting cycle. A human pilot finds a target, identifies it, designates it, releases a weapon, confirms the kill, then moves to the next one. That loop took minutes per vehicle. Against 50,000 tanks, minutes per vehicle meant you ran out of war before you ran out of targets. The question became radical, almost heretical for the time. What if the weapon didn't need the pilot to find the target at all? The answer came from a place no one expected. Not from the aircraft, not from the pilot, not from a satellite, but from the bomb itself. And building it required solving a sequence of engineering problems that had never been attempted in combination. The concept that emerged in the early 1980s at Textron Defense Systems was deceptively simple in theory and nightmarish in execution. A single canister, the size of a standard 1,000-pound bomb, would contain 10 submunitions. Each submunition would contain 4 individual warheads called Skeets. Drop one bomb, get 40 independent kill vehicles. But those 40 Skeets couldn't just scatter randomly like conventional cluster bomblets. Each one had to find its own target, autonomously, in the seconds between deployment and impact. Here's the sequence, and every step had to work perfectly, or the whole chain failed. The pilot releases the canister at altitude. A timed fuse opens the casing, and the 10 submunitions deploy. Each submunition pops a small parachute, not to slow it down gently, but to stabilize it and start it spinning. That spin is critical. It turns each submunition into a scanning platform, rotating in a wide cone as it descends. Mounted on the base of each submunition is a dual-mode sensor, infrared and laser radar working together. As the submunition spins, that sensor sweeps the ground below in an expanding spiral, covering an area the size of several football fields in a matter of seconds. The infrared detector is looking for heat signatures, the thermal bloom of an engine, the hot exhaust of a vehicle that's been running. But heat alone isn't enough. Burning debris gives off heat. Smoldering buildings give off heat. So the laser radar provides shape discrimination. It bounces a pulse off whatever the infrared has flagged and reads the return. Is this object the right size, the right height off the ground? Does its profile match the signature library of known armored vehicles? If both sensors agree, hot and the right shape, the Skeet fires. Not downward, sideways. An explosively formed penetrator, a copper disc backed by high explosive, detonates, and the blast reshapes the copper into a hypersonic slug moving at over a mile per second. It punches through the top armor of a tank, the thinnest part of any armored vehicle, where no designer ever expected a threat to come from. The entire sequence, from canister release to Skeet detonation takes less than 30 seconds. And it all happens without a single human being making a single decision after the pilot's finger leaves the release button. Major Greg Satch Grunewald banked his F-16 over the Tigris River Valley on the night of April 6, 2003, and saw what looked like a parking lot on fire. Below him, stretched along Highway 9 northwest of Baghdad, an entire Iraqi Republican Guard armored division was pulling back from its defensive positions. Hundreds of vehicles nose to tail on a two-lane road, trying to reposition before the American ground advance cut them off. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks loaded with ammunition, command vehicles with antennas still transmitting. A column so long it disappeared into the darkness beyond his targeting pod's field of view. For 30 years, this was the scenario. Not a theoretical one drawn up in a Pentagon briefing room. Not a tabletop exercise with cardboard counters representing Soviet tank regiments. A real armored column, densely packed, moving in the open, exactly the kind of target that NATO war planners had spent 4 decades saying couldn't be killed fast enough. The nightmare had arrived, just wearing a different flag than anyone had expected. Grunewald wasn't carrying laser-guided bombs. He wasn't talking to a forward air controller on the ground painting targets with an infrared designator. He was carrying CBU-97 Sensor Fuzed Weapons, the canisters that Textron had spent nearly 20 years perfecting in the New Mexico desert. And his instructions were almost absurdly simple for a mission against a division-strength armored formation. Fly over the column, release the weapon, leave. He released 2 canisters. The rest took less time than it takes to describe. The canisters cracked open, 20 submunitions deployed into the night air, each one popping its parachute and beginning its slow spinning descent. 80 Skeets armed themselves, their infrared eyes opening, their laser radars pulsing. Below them, the Iraqi column had no idea anything was falling. There was no warning, no laser energy to trigger a detector, no radar emission to trip an alarm, no sound above the rumble of diesel engines. The weapons were autonomous, passive until the final fraction of a second, and completely silent. Then 80 copper discs detonated almost simultaneously. The effect on the column was catastrophic. Vehicles that had been running moments earlier were now burning from the inside out, their top armor peeled open by penetrators that arrived faster than the speed of sound. The explosions cascaded, ammunition stores cooking off, fuel tanks rupturing, secondary blasts chaining from one vehicle to the next. Crews in vehicles that hadn't been hit panicked, abandoned their machines, and ran. The column didn't just stop, it disintegrated. Vehicles at the rear tried to reverse, collided with each other, and blocked the road in both directions. Within minutes, what had been an organized military retreat became a miles-long graveyard of burning steel. 2 canisters, 1 aircraft, 1 pass. No loitering, no re-attack, no exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The pilot was already 20 miles away before the first secondary explosion lit up the horizon behind him. Battle damage assessment the following morning confirmed what the thermal imagery had suggested overnight. The sensor-fused weapons had hit their targets with a reliability that startled even the engineers who built them. Individual Skeets had discriminated between tanks and soft-skinned trucks, preferentially striking the highest-value armored targets in the column. Some had passed over unarmored vehicles entirely, their sensors rejecting the thermal and radar returns as insufficient matches, and detonated only when they found something that fit the profile. The weapons hadn't just killed vehicles, they had chosen which vehicles to kill. And that distinction between a weapon that destroys whatever it lands on and a weapon that decides what is worth destroying is the line the sensor-fused weapon crossed. No one used the word autonomous in the program briefs. No one talked about artificial intelligence. The language was clinical. Smart sub-munitions, sensor-fused technology. Fire and forget. But the function was unmistakable. A machine, falling through the dark over Iraq, evaluated targets against criteria, made engagement decisions, and executed lethal action, all in less time than it takes a human being to blink twice. The Cold War scenario that spawned the weapon had never materialized. Soviet tanks never poured through the Fulda Gap. But the engineering built to solve that problem worked exactly as designed on a highway outside Baghdad, against an enemy the weapon's creators had never imagined. In a war that didn't exist when the first prototype was tested, the bomb found its own targets. And it didn't miss. What does it sound like when a machine makes a kill decision? Nothing. That's the answer nobody wanted to sit with. The Skeet doesn't click. It doesn't beep. There's no dramatic hum of a computer thinking, no targeting reticle locking on, no voice announcing target acquired. The infrared sensor registers a thermal differential. The laser radar returns a profile match. A circuit closes. Copper becomes a liquid fist moving at 6,000 feet per second. The entire decision tree, detect, discriminate, engage, executes in a silence so total that the crew inside the tank never hears the thing that kills them. The Iraqi tankers on Highway 9 died in a gap between sounds. The last thing most of them heard was their own engine. The penetrator arrived before the sound of its own detonation. One moment, you're gripping a steering lever, watching the taillights of the vehicle ahead of you, thinking about the American ground forces that are somewhere to the south and whether your officers have any idea where they're leading you. The next moment doesn't exist for you anymore. There is no next moment. And 20 miles away, climbing back to altitude, the pilot who released the weapon felt almost nothing. No recoil, no flash in his cockpit. He'd pressed a button and banked left, the same mechanical motion as releasing a fuel tank. Grunewald later described the thermal imagery, the blooming white signatures appearing in sequence across his targeting pod display, with the detached precision of a man watching lab results come in. It worked. That was the dominant emotion. Not horror, not triumph. Engineering satisfaction. The system performed within parameters. That gap between the violence on the ground and the sterility in the cockpit is the thing the sensor-fused weapon was actually designed to create. Every engineering choice pushed the human further from the moment of killing. The pilot doesn't choose the target. The pilot doesn't see the target. The pilot doesn't even confirm the kill in real time. He releases a canister into the air and leaves. Everything that follows is a conversation between a sensor and a circuit board, conducted in milliseconds, in the dark, without witnesses. Before the CBU-97, killing a tank required a human being to look at it, to point something at it, to hold steady while a missile flew or a laser guided a bomb, knowing the whole time what was about to happen, and choosing in each passing second not to break the lock. There was a moral weight built into the physical act, the trembling crosshair, the conscious decision sustained over time. After the CBU-97, that weight evaporated. The kill still happened. The tank still burned. The crew still died, but the human decision compressed to a single moment. The release, and everything after that belonged to the machine. On Highway 9, in the spring of 2003, copper hunted steel in the dark, and the only sound was burning. The wind off the Tigris carries diesel and dust in equal measure, and on the stretch of Highway 9 where the Republican Guard division died, the smell hasn't entirely changed. The Iraqis rebuilt the road within a year. They had to. It was a main artery, and commerce doesn't wait for the burned-out hulks to cool. The wrecks were pushed to the shoulders, then dragged to scrapyards, then melted down and sold. Some of that steel probably ended up in rebar. Some of it is holding up apartment buildings in Mosul. The war recycled itself, the way wars do. But here's where the story turns, in a direction nobody at Textron or the Pentagon or Air Combat Command saw coming. The sensor-fused weapon worked. It worked so well that it became the single most effective anti-armor munition used in the 2003 invasion, pound for pound, sortie for sortie. The Air Force couldn't stop talking about it. Congressional briefings featured thermal footage of Highway 9. Budget requests cited the engagement as proof of concept for an entire generation of autonomous strike weapons. The CBU-97 was the future, and the future had arrived early. Then the future got banned. In 2008, 111 nations signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions in Dublin, prohibiting the production, stockpiling, and use of cluster bombs, a category that included, by any honest reading of the engineering, the sensor fused weapon. The United States refused to sign. So did Russia, China, India, and every other nation that actually manufactured the things. But the treaty created a political reality that was harder to ignore than a legal one. Allied nations that had signed couldn't operate alongside American aircraft dropping cluster munitions without risking their own treaty compliance. NATO interoperability, the very thing the weapon had been built to protect, became the reason it couldn't be used. Textron stopped production in 2016. Not because the weapon didn't work, not because something better replaced it, because the diplomatic cost of keeping it exceeded the military value of owning it. The company couldn't sell it abroad, couldn't find new domestic orders, and couldn't justify the production line for a munition that made allies nervous. The factory in Wilmington, Massachusetts went quiet. The last CBU-105, the upgraded wind-corrected version of the original, rolled off the line and into storage, where it joined several thousand of its siblings in climate-controlled bunkers across the American Southwest, waiting for a war that policy says they can't fight. Meanwhile, the problem the weapon was built to solve came back, not in the Fulda Gap, in Ukraine. Beginning in 2022, Russian armored columns pushed south and east in formations that looked, on satellite imagery, on drone footage, on thermal cameras, almost identical to the nightmare scenario that haunted NATO planners in 1975. Long columns on narrow roads, tanks bunched at choke points. Exactly the kind of target density that the CBU-97 had been engineered to erase. The Ukrainians didn't have sensor-fused weapons. What they had were Turkish-made Bayraktar drones and Swedish-made NLAWs and American-made Javelins, all of which required a human being to find the target, identify the target, and pull the trigger. One vehicle at a time, the old way, the slow way, the way the sensor-fused weapon had been invented to replace. And the Russians? The Russians had studied Highway 9. They'd read the after-action reports. They knew what autonomous top-attack munitions could do to a packed column. So they built their own version, the MOTIV-3M, a sensor-fused submunition designed to do exactly what the American Skeet had done to the Republican Guard. They used them in Ukraine, against the same kind of targets, with the same physics. The stretch of Highway 9 is a 4-lane expressway now. There's a gas station where the column's lead vehicles burned. It sells ice cream.